Well, welcome everybody here. As we're kind of getting the tech set up, I'll give a little background here. I'm going to let Madelsar say her name fully in the correct pronunciation in just a moment, but I'll give a little background on why we invited her and why we're so excited to hear from her. I am friends and colleagues with Chris LaFranchi, who is the executive director of One Reef, and they're based here in Santa Cruz, California, and they work all over Micronesia, kind of South Pacific region, Palau, Yap, Pohnpei, a number of islands, and they do really interesting conservation-based incentive agreements that are, I'm sure our speaker, will tell you all about. But we've been working with Chris for about 10 years. A number of IEP students have gone on summer fellowships to Palau and to Yap, to other parts of the South Pacific, to work with Chris's organization. Madelsar is a new hire that Chris speaks incredibly highly of, and we knew we wanted to hear direct from the source. So that's why we invited her today to talk about the work in Micronesia and the area. So Rachel, any update here? Has the file hasn't come through yet?
Actually, it's still loading.
Okay.
Because of all the photos. Yeah.
PowerPoint. Okay. Do you maybe want to just say a few introductory remarks while we wait?
Yeah, I can go ahead and introduce myself. So the Palauan pronunciation of my name is Madelsar Ngiraingas, but and I always put on my presentations Ms. Madelsar Ngiraingas because people don't always know if I'm a male or female just looking at my name. So I actually was born and raised here in Palau, went to school for my bachelor's degrees at Washington State University, and then went on to get a master's degree at University of California, San Diego. My background is in ethnic studies, so I'm a social scientist, and I always have to tell people that I'm not a natural scientist, and so I don't get into the sciences very much. I have enough understanding to do the kind of work I do in environmental conservation. I moved back to Palau after graduate school in 2008 and joined One Reef in 2018. But I've been sort of thrown into the environmental conservation sector upon arrival. My original intention was to actually work somewhere and do cultural preservation. And I quickly realized that they both go hand in hand, especially here in our region. So as you'll see, if we can take a look at my PowerPoint later, environmental conservation is, it's integrated, it's extremely integral to cultural preservation. And what I want to talk about today is traditional stewardship, which is something that is not new, but our team at One Reef has sort of began to focus more closely on this as a part of a solution to getting higher impact in our region. And so if folks aren't familiar with One Reef, I want to explain that we do work primarily in Micronesia. And Micronesia is one of the 3 Pacific Island regions. There's also Polynesia and Melanesia. And the islands that make up Micronesia are Palau, the Republic of Marshall Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia, Guam, and the Marianas Islands are part of our region, but because they are under the United States, they don't always fall under the same sort of purview in terms of the kind of assistance and support that they receive. So oftentimes they're much more advanced and or not part of many of our discussions. So I just wanted to say that and let you know that my role at One Reef, I am the Community Partnerships Manager. And basically, I just coordinate all the different activities and community partnerships that we have currently. Right now, we have 13 communities that we work in. Two of them are here in Palau. One is Helen Reef in Hota'obe State. We also have Ngiraingas State, and then we're signing on a new state, Sonsorol State. And these are states in the northern and most southern parts of our island, and most of the communities that we work with in the Federated States of Micronesia are also considered remote outer islands. So I think it's really important for me to mention that, because part of the reason why we spend so much time with these particular communities, they tend to have smaller populations, anywhere between 100 people to 300, 400 sometimes in their communities. And so they tend to have limited resources all around, financial, human, and whatnot. So we try to extend support to them as much as possible. Many of the communities in which we work in have marine protected areas. As you know, One Reef does do, our main focus is on coral reef health. And so we work in communities who have identified or designated marine protected areas. I think it's really important for me to mention, though, that traditionally in our islands, bounded spaces are not a norm. And so this is a very newer sort of approach to conservation. And so we're really trying to understand how to work within this new sort of dynamic. Most of the time, we've realized these days that even though they have MPAs in place, a lot of times much of the work that communities tend to do end up preserving or managing everything else outside of the MPA, which is something that we've discovered more recently. And a lot of our traditional leaders and elders made this known to us more recently, because they used to not be so forthright in their communications. I think when we transitioned into a more Western type of lifestyle, we readily accepted Western science and technology to help inform the ways in which we manage our spaces. And so a lot of our traditional leaders and our elders tended to perhaps devalue their own knowledge, and have since come out more recently and expressed some of the things that they find disconcerting in terms of how we're doing natural resource management these days. So these spaces are also generally considered sacred areas. And this is mainly because the origin of our islands tend to have these sort of metaphysical, supernatural, nothing? Yeah, it's still loading. Sorry, Rachel.
If you want, you can try again on the share screen. I can see if I can, maybe I'll push that button too and try to see what you're.
I see it now. There it is.
Ah, great.
Oh, there we go.
Okay.
All right. Nice.
So is this on presentation screen for you folks? Now it is.
Yeah, perfect. And real quick, just as I think perfect segue, that was a great introduction. And I think I want to ask you questions about that kind of the traditional knowledge that's now coming to the fore that might have been a little suppressed for a while. And that's just such a fascinating way to start this. So thank you so much again for coming. And we're really happy that the technology is working. So thanks so much.
So shall I continue?
Please.
So the title of my presentation is in English, My Life, My Responsibility. Translated in my language is Klangarangagik Ingar Alel. So the reason why I chose this title is because more and more we're realizing that everything we do in environmental conservation has everything to do with everything in our daily lives here on the islands. And I'm not saying that it's very different from other folks, but I think for us it's extremely obvious and much more sort of in our face. And so this is why I've taken on this particular title. And I actually borrowed it from another community in our region and asked permission to use it. Okay, so again, One Reef, just to give another perspective of what we do a lot of surveillance and enforcement support to these communities, again, because oftentimes they're remote islands, atolls, and they actually manage a very large body of ocean and therefore do not have the resources to patrol the entire area. And in many cases, they have designated their entire marine area as an MPA. And so they have quite an expanse of space that they have to cover. We also do, we also work with donors to supply our community partners with equipment and supplies, do trainings and mentorings, and I'll go through that later on. But for the most part, we really just support their existing management plans that they have already established for their marine protected areas. So again, for those who aren't familiar with our region, Micronesia is in the northwesternmost part of the Pacific. And you know, oftentimes I have to admit, especially while I was in the United States, many times we kind of get overlooked because Polynesia, for the most part, is much more familiar to other folks, you know. And then I think Melanesia has grown in popularity as well. And so Micronesia, as the label states, we have smaller islands and many times, you know, and our populations are really small, but we now have a huge diaspora all over the world. So very similar to Polynesia and Melanesia. And again, I just wanted to highlight again the fact that a lot of the island communities that we work with are remote. They're often excluded in their national political regimes. Oftentimes we get things like they don't have enough people to justify funding for their communities. They're too far away to justify expending that much funding to transport and bring resources to their islands. And so in many cases, we find that they're excluded from a lot of the opportunities that other communities are open to. And then otherwise, they're actually just really disregarded in many ways. Again, they're small communities, you know, and this is something that Chris LaFranchi shared with me, and I unfortunately have not gone out to verify this, but apparently 5% of conservation resources around the world actually reach our region. And so that was sort of a figure that I thought was quite shocking, particularly because we cover such a huge area of the globe in terms of our oceans. And again, the sacred spaces that I referred to, these spaces are still in existence. They're still very much valued. Oftentimes, they're spaces in which our communities continue to draw valuable resources like traditional medicinal plants, a lot of our food, staple foods, And for the most part, this is where we generally are rooted in our traditional belief systems. And so they're still very important to this day. Again, a lot of natural resources can be drawn, and yet I say this and can say with definity that we have seen a huge negative impact from climate change, but also other pressures. For our region, we get a lot of pressure from mass tourism. So we've seen a major decline in our fish stocks, a lot of development activity that has contributed to erosion and sedimentation, which has affected our coral reefs. And so a lot of these traditional resources that we've drawn in the past we're finding they're quite limited today. And still yet, we can still boast that our region holds a tremendous amount of biodiversity. Scientists claim here and there, and the number changes based on what I've read, that about 80% of the planet's biodiversity can be found in the Pacific. And so I think that's a striking number and calls for some attention, particularly. And I think that's sort of what we're seeing in the move towards a blue economy. So what I wanted to focus on today is this idea of traditional stewardship. And this is derived from three things. This idea of place, our islands, our identity as a people, our culture, and this idea of connectivity and reciprocity, which is very, very important in terms of natural resource management in the past. So to discuss place, I wanted to use Palau as an example. And again, Palau is the northwesternmost Micronesian island, closest to Asia. And so we get a lot of tourism from Asia and Europe, actually, and most recently Australia. In the past, it was primarily from the United States. So this is Palau, an aerial view. We have about 500 limestone islands scattered about our reefs. And there are three major island groupings. So we have the northern atoll of Kayang State. And then the main group in the middle is where you would have Babeldaub and Koror. And then we have the southwestern islands of Sonsorol and Hato'obe. And they're quite close to Indonesia. And so we have ongoing negotiations with Indonesia about our maritime boundaries. Excuse me. So just a little background about Palau. There are less than 20,000 people on the planet, Palauans on the planet. So not even on our island. So globally, and I don't know how accurate that is, but there's very few of us. Our government system has 16 states, and it's set up very similar to the United States. We follow the democratic system, but we also still have our traditional system in place. Again, we have the three island groupings, the north, the mid, the central, and then the southwest islands. And of course, if you don't know already about Palau, we're most popular for scuba diving, Jellyfish Lake, which is a lake that has millions of jellyfish that have lost their stinging ability, and then our rock islands, as you saw in the previous pictures. So to share a little bit about our culture and our people, our traditional belief system, as I mentioned before, has a very supernatural, spiritual dynamic to it. And so we believed since our ancestors that any knowledge, our possessions, the island, the sea, our skills we've received from the gods. And so this, demanded a certain level of respect for traditional knowledge, traditional practices, our system that has been put in place. And it also required us as peoples in this place to safeguard and be guardians of this particular space. Our oral histories, all the legends of different deities, they have embedded within them lessons on how to manage resources, how to think about collective well-being, and different principles and tenets that we continue to follow today, like respect, reciprocity, give and take. And this goes both ways for both between humans, but also between ourselves and nature. So I can, tell you, as I was growing up, my dad would make comments like, we would be walking home from school and my brother would have a stick and he'd be whacking, the leaves as we were walking home, and he'd see us and he would scold us. And he said, "Why are you hitting the leaves? They didn't do anything to you." And then my grandmother would go into this whole story about how our ancestors would get reincarnated and they could become plants and animals in our environment. And so we had to be very respectful of all living creatures at all times. And so those were kinds of things that we grew up hearing and learning about. And so I dare to say I sent you a paper, and it wasn't the full paper now that I went back and looked, Rachel, but I have the citation in another slide. But this paper was written by Dr. Minoru Uegi. He is an elder now. He's a farmer, he's a businessman, and he talks in length about how eco-consciousness was sort of built into our traditional way of life. And he gives very specific examples of legends and different practices that we've continued to use to this day, and how those represented our eco-consciousness. And a lot of it is based on this idea of our kinship with the natural environment. And it was really based as well on our people having really good observation skills. I would say they were scientists in their own rights. A lot of our fishermen, my dad, he navigated at night without, back then, flashlights. I don't recall flashlights until I was probably in 6th grade. And so, we were able to navigate and travel between our islands at night. And I attribute that to the fact that, the oral history, the lessons that were passed on, and then their really intimate knowledge of the environment, just based on empirical observations. Our traditional system is really based on very clear gender roles. And I want to emphasize that while they were separate roles and responsibilities for males and females, they were equally valued for the survival and sustainability of our people. So I have a very different take on, gender dynamics in our region. When other gender scholars visit, we have lengthy discussions about this, because I don't think that we thought of them as lesser or more superior than the other. It was really important for women to nurture and care for children and the development of children in their early ages. They were responsible for food preparation and gathering food products from land. And we also have women fishers who actually glean some of the fish species that are near shore. So those were some of their primary responsibilities. And they also, I want to call them hydro engineers, because it was their responsibility in the past to maintain the waterways in the village and in the farms. And so they were able to ensure the maintenance of those waterways. And that also contributed to, you know, the health of our coral reef systems. Males, on their other hands, probably typical, did much harder labor. They were fishers in the open water. They did navigation. They did a lot of the infrastructure work in the communities and villages. And then they were also primarily responsible for handling the ceremonial activities of that time. So there's a photo on the top left-hand corner, and this is a photo of a group of men pounding what we call sakao in Pohnpei. And this is kind of like the Fijian, why did it just slip my mind? It's a Fijian drink that kind of gives you a,
is it kava?
Kava, yeah, Fijian kava. So sakao is very similar to kava, except they drink it straight away. There's no refining of this. So there's a lot of root particles that you can see. And so for some people, they just can't handle it. And then our traditional leaders had very specific responsibilities. They were decision makers, but it was also their responsibility to make sure that they got the right information from the other members of the community. So they would consult with the fishers, they would consult with the farmers, and get as much information as they needed to be able to make decisions on a day-to-day about the management of the communities. So traditional leadership in the past was really important in terms of maintaining harmony, ensuring the well-being of the community and safety, and then also required them to conduct themselves in a, you know, with dignity and integrity. And they followed these principles very closely. These were principles that they followed to conduct business, to interact with community members, and go about their day-to-day business. So I want to bring these up again simply, and this is the citation that I mentioned. This is the correct full-length paper that if you're interested, you could go read. And he really does a very good job of, you know, outlining specifically how our traditional system had eco-consciousness embedded in it already. But anyway, I think, you know, the idea here that I want to emphasize is that the traditional system depended on everybody to respect the system and the leaders and each other, have confidence in the decisions that were made, to comply, you know, and to always have some level of humility. And so here in our region, I think we take humility maybe a little too far these days in terms of politics and other matters, but in the past, the idea was to always have fairness, maintain justice and harmony for all folks in the communities. So these are really important sort of principles that we're really trying to draw out and find value again. And so this leads us to the third thing around traditional stewardship, connectivity and reciprocity. And basically, this is where I think that there is a disconnect between perhaps the past and the modern way of doing things. In the past, we really encouraged and promoted and advocated that, never to take more than we needed, ever. So growing up, my dad would only fish what we needed to have for our meals for the next few days. There was an incident where we were on our island and they were killing turtles, which I really, for some reason, just never took to very well. And so I was really upset. And I took one of the turtles and I started running off with it because I didn't want them to kill the turtle. And he scolded me, told me to go back to the women. And my grandmother then proceeded to explain to me that it was okay to take resources so long as we don't take more than we needed. And there happened to have been a customary event that we needed to have these turtles for, and which is why my relatives were killing all these turtles. So this is one of those things that perhaps we have sort of abused over time. Eventually, growing up, I recall my dad being one of the first fishermen to export fish off of Palau to Guam and Saipan to sell. And I could not understand how that made any sense. And a colleague who's no longer with us at One Reef, she had used this concept of cognitive dissonance. And I had to go back and really, read through it and try to understand it. And I think that's what's happened these days. We found ways to sort of compartmentalize all the things that are happening and how we're trying to survive and get through our daily lives. So this leads us to the new challenge that I think we're all faced with, not only in our region, but elsewhere, for a lot of these indigenous communities. And this is a photo that I had put, and it should have been before this. This is my father at the bottom center, cleaning fish. And this is our small island. And I guess I just wanted to show that reciprocity was really important, still is important for our people in terms of conservation, and how it was so relevant for me growing up. But moving on to the new challenges, the fact that our island is sort of operating under a dual government system. So we have the democratic system and then our traditional system still in play. So the top right, left-hand corner, you see our traditional men's meeting house, which is called an abai. That's where all the decision-making used to be made. And then you have the Palau Supreme Court in the center there, and then our Capitol building, which looks very similar to the US Capitol, I think. So, this is a contrast of these dual systems in play. And then we have this cash economy where we use the US dollar. And then these two other photos on the slide are Palauan money, and I'm wearing one right now. This is our traditional form of money that women generally managed and controlled. I don't know if I mentioned earlier, but Palau is a matriarchal system. And so everything goes through our line, our lineage, land, possessions, goes through the female line. It's changing very quickly with the legal system and people having wills put in place. So this is sort of where we're finding a lot of challenges these days. And so it's conflicting with a lot of the traditional core values that I had mentioned earlier. So again, this is very self-explanatory, but we've moved away primarily from a communal setting where the well-being of an entire community was at the heart of daily operations, to now a lifestyle of, you know, everybody has to get up and go to a job and earn a wage. And then we have the democratic principles in place where individual freedoms and rights kind of tend to contradict some of our traditional ways of thinking and doing things. So it becomes a very tricky situation when we're working in our communities as One Reef. We tend to come in and want to partner with our communities. And I think what we noticed is that in the past, maybe other organizations, you know, they might call them partnerships, but there was an unequal playing field at all times. And what we've seen, what I've seen personally in a lot of these organizations and partnerships is the community is then driven by the funding that these partners are providing, rather than they themselves sort of deciding on what their priorities are and how they want to approach conservation. And so it becomes a very it becomes a very contentious setting for everybody, and we find ways to have to balance that, and it's very tricky. Right now, I think what we're feeling across the region in all of our communities is a sense of urgency. A lot of our elders are passing on and taking their traditional knowledge with them, a lot of the practices with them. Of course, everything's changed. The way we do our customs have changed. It's a lot of times based on the US dollar anymore, rather than contributions from, you know, different individuals in the community. And so that really creates a lot of division. Also, when we're talking about traditional titles, our traditional titles are connected to our lands. And so when there's a dispute over a traditional title, then the land is also sort of held up and it can't be developed. It goes oftentimes to litigation, and it can be in litigation for upwards of 20 years. And some of these elders have passed on before the lands are actually even litigated. And so this creates a lot of problem for development and progressive movement in our countries. This is a photo of my grandmother, both of my maternal and paternal grandmothers. And I wanted to just throw this in there. I'm very fortunate that they're still alive, and they were both avid farmers. And although I don't do farming like they did because I have to have a regular job, I am a weekend farmer and have acquired a lot of their knowledge and skills, but unfortunately, I'm not passing it on to my own children because now they're in college and there's just that disconnect. So what we are trying to do here at One Reef is across the region, reconnect our youth to the environment and to a lot of the traditions that we have relied on for our survival as a people and for the, you know, sustainability of our environment in general. So this summer, we held our first traditional stewardship summer camp in Sonsorol State, which is one of our Southwest islands. And we were able to bring about 20 young girls and boys out to the island. And on this island, there's no internet, there's no electricity, there are no phones, no television. And so they really were able to experience the full scope of living off of the land and the sea. And so during their time there, the photo top left, the boys are learning navigation skills. And the bottom there, the girls are going to collect water for a project that they were doing. And, you know, they're doing some weaving here. And this is a picture of the young boys on the ship on their way to Sonsorol, which is about 28-hour trip on a liveaboard. So they were heading out there. So we were able to have the summer camp, and my colleague Wayne Andrew, who's been doing this for many more years than I have, learned a lot from this, and I think we're going to be instituting this across the region. The other thing that One Reef does, I think, really well is connecting donors to the projects and communities that we have out here. And so here we have a community in Pohnpei. This is Ant Atoll. And the gentleman in the light blue tank top in the top left photo is the High Chief Rosa of Ant Atoll. And he was there meeting with Chris LaFranchi and some of our partners and funders who went on an expedition, a 10-day expedition out there to visit the island and do some diving and meet the people. And so they were able to connect and build some relationships. So that was it's always good. And we're planning another trip this year, if everything works out with COVID, to bring out other interested investors. We also do mentoring and training of our communities, primarily in surveillance and enforcement. And so while these guys grew up all their lives on these islands and in their communities, the way that enforcement and surveillance is taking place now is very much foreign to them. So our traditional system relied on this mutual respect and understanding of, you know, all the management rules, if you will. So when the chiefs put out their decrees, everybody knew to follow it. There was some level of respect and compliance. So we didn't need rangers and conservation officers. But today, again, because of the way that we've sort of structured conservation in terms of marine protected areas and the expanse of ocean that these guys have to cover in a day, we're bringing in technology and science and different tools to help them be able to do this in a more cost-effective and efficient manner. In this slide, you see Dr. Stuart Sandin from Scripps Institute of Oceanography over at UC San Diego. He and his team have been working with One Reef and coming out to our region for several years now. And in this slide, he's training our teams. This took place last year. He's training our teams to use a new 3D mosaic technology that they do transects, and then they use the camera and take photos of the space, and then we send off all that raw data back to Scripps, and they send us a 3D image of that entire space. And what's really exciting about this, I got super excited about this because this is the first time, I think, that we're going to be able to show our communities what the reefs look like. So while we live on an island and we're right next to the ocean, I want to say that probably 80% of our people have never seen the coral reefs, simply because we just swim near shore. They don't dive, they don't scuba dive. And so this is so exciting to be able to show them what we're doing and why it's necessary to do coral reef conservation and monitoring. And then also do a time sequence. So Scripps has developed this technology where they can take photos and images over a course of several years, and we can see the changes over time. So this has been a really exciting partnership for us to be able to have this technology and have our own guys trained to do it and be able to communicate within their communities about what's happening. The other thing that our funders are able to help us with is provide equipment and supplies that our communities need. So the top left-hand photo is a photo of a floating ranger station. And this is something that one of our communities sort of thought of and was able to construct, and it's really helpful for those remote, islands where they have a huge area to cover. They can just send out their rangers and rotate them over several days, and so they can just stay out there and be out there while they're monitoring their area. And this is really useful. I mean, just the presence of this floating ranger station has actually deterred poachers. So it's actually working, and so we're really excited. And this particular ranger station costs anywhere between 10 to 15,000. So it's not that expensive, and so many of our donors are much more willing to support something like this because they see it on the ground, it actually works, and they can get some measures of how it's impacting these communities and these sites. The bottom left-hand photo is another ranger station, but this was designed by another community to suit their purposes, and they were able to get more funding to be able to make it a fiberglass sort of operation that you see there. So we're planning to build 2 more of these ranger stations in some of our other communities, hopefully by next year. And then the photos on the right are just basic patrol and surveillance equipment that we've raised money for through global giving. So we're now using crowd sharing platforms online, and people have been able to donate, and we've been able to send basic equipment to these communities for their use. This is actually a video, and so I'm not quite sure. The audio will come out through my computer, is that right?
Good work.
There's
Okay.
there's one, well, we can give it a shot, but there's a button on the share screen. Well, just try it.
Working.
You hear it?
Science is a valuable tool that can help document.
Yeah, the connection is, I think the sound's not going with it now.
Temperature getting warmer, acidification of
No, it's
ocean.
good. That's
But don't unmute yourself. It's coming through your speakers. Sorry, I meant do unmute yourself so that
Understand and be able to make decisions. At the same time, it will also be very important to validate some of the important traditional knowledge that we have relied on for many generations in managing our resources.
Perhaps one of my favorite parts of working in the Southwest Islands of Palau is to recognize that intimate relationship that exists across forms of human knowledge. Our recent expedition included bringing scientific tools, modern cameras to the reefs of the Southwest Islands to document what's there. But at the same time, we met with folks from the Hautahope State, the colleagues that have been thinking about these reefs for generations, where generation upon generation had been watching and learning what was happening underwater. The conversations we had on the boat, we shared stories about spawning times, about distributions of corals, the scientific stories, the traditional stories. They're all stories of what's happening underwater. I've been particularly impressed by the people in the Hautahope State. the ability to use the traditional ecological knowledge, this view of the natural resources, with a supremely thoughtful stewardship protocol. When one species is becoming rare, protections are put on that species. And when there's a problem for the human community, resources are used. There's a balance in intimate relationship between the human and the underwater world. In some cases, the science seems moot. It seems like the problems are solved. It seems like the reefs in Helen have everything going for them. A great community of people working with them. I've been particularly impressed by the traditional stewardship that exists in the Hautauhe state and by the folks living on Toby to protect the resources from generation to generation. I feel honored that we're able to work there and to tell stories from science that really are just recapitulations of the traditional knowledge that's existed in the region for generations.
Right. So it worked. Oops. So I just wanted to end with that. And then this last slide, simply to showcase that it's extremely important, I think, when working, particularly in the indigenous communities who have a long-standing sort of history of stewardship and guardianship of their spaces, perhaps to help them, draw out a lot of that knowledge and some of those practices, and perhaps they can be combined with a lot of the science and technology today to be able to have a greater impact on environmental conservation and sustainable development. So in this slide, there's a question that was posed at a Pacific meeting that was held in Honolulu earlier this year in February, and it was hosted by Niatero, and I don't know if you're familiar with them, but you could Google them. Niatero is a new organization that does a lot of work in indigenous communities who are doing guardianship work in their spaces. And they simply pose this question of what kind of ancestor do you want to be? And I think that's a really powerful question that we are starting to ask ourselves and ask our people to ask themselves. And then, from there, be able to understand, what approaches might be the best for the modern day dynamics. And then, again, just to emphasize my points, traditional knowledge and practices are truly legitimate ways of knowing. It's not necessarily documented anywhere, and we're trying to do a better job of that these days. But it can definitely complement a lot of the work that's being carried out globally. And so I think what I failed to do here is really, tell folks, what they could do to support a lot of the kind of work that's taking place in our region by One Reef and many other organizations and communities. But there's little things, individual things, community things, political things. So at the very least, you yourself can play your part and contribute to a positive impact globally. If you guys have questions or would like to contact me or anybody at One Reef, feel free to reach us. I have my email there and our website. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was really great. It's fascinating to learn that so many Palauans have never seen the reefs, right? It's world famous. And Chris always shows me these pictures, and to think that the people who, are native to the area have not seen them is such a shock to when it has that world prestige, so just a fascinating statistic. I wanted to ask you specifically about a management question. Like, could you give us some specific examples about how the traditional knowledge has influenced the management of the reefs and the MPAs. And I thought it was fascinating what you said about even just kind of fixed political boundaries for MPAs isn't something, in your knowledge. So just wondering how the knowledge impacts, the actual on the ground management. And thank you again.
No problem. Thanks for your question. So particularly for Palau, a lot of the MPAs that have been established were established. It's very clear why we need to have MPAs in terms of conservation work, right? And, we have to have ways to monitor and measure and evaluate, and then we have to be able to develop budgets and, understand how many resources are needed to manage a particular space. So I think we moved into doing things that way just because it was necessary, but communities themselves are consulted, and a lot of times here in Palau, the Palau Conservation Society, which is a nonprofit organization, it traditionally or historically worked with communities and community leaders to identify these areas. And many times the areas were identified based on communities' knowledge or understanding of and observations of the changes that were made. And then using the legal system, those areas were designated through state governments, through actual laws that were passed by their legislatures. And so the MPAs are legislated and they do have regulations that go with them. But more recently, we're seeing in some of our communities where, I think we've heard in the last 10, 15 years that enforcement has been really weak and not, it hasn't worked. And so we've all kind of sat down and tried to think about why is this? And for the most part, enforcement is done from a very, perhaps Western style. And so in that way, individuals will try to find loopholes or go around laws and regulations. And, our traditional system was really dependent on when a traditional leader or chief created a bull, and in our language it's called a bull. It's a traditional moratorium, and they could either designate an area and no entry, no activity there. So it's very similar to what we have in place these days. Or they could identify a species that couldn't be fished or hunted or caught. So we had these practices in place previously. And people who didn't comply with those bull were generally, held to a very different standard. It wasn't a penalty in terms of a fine necessarily. Your family's honor was at stake. Your community or your clan's reputation was at stake. So there was a lot more internal, there was a moral compass that everybody had, right? That followed this system of managing natural resources and behaviors. So I don't know if that answered your question. And
no, that was great. Yeah, that was great. That especially on the enforcement, which is always the hardest piece. So I don't want to take up all the time here, but thank you for that. And Rachel, if you want to take some of the other questions.
We have one more question and we are almost at time. So I just want to make sure I show we have maybe 2 minutes left. So Ulukoa, if you want to go ahead and ask your question, but maybe just one of the two, I can be sure to send the whole thing to Madelsar offline.
Okay, I'll be quick. It's a super long question. Aloha. Thank you for putting this presentation on. This is just awesome, wonderful, amazing. Okay, I had two questions. One had to do with the influence of individuals on the process and the interplay between connectivity, identity, and the stewardship, and how one affects the other. Or the other question has to do with Palau's efforts in relation to regional efforts and the cooperation of global leaders, who are oftentimes the worst culprits, that we're trying to protect from. So whichever one. Thank you.
So
Aloha.
I'll take a stab at your second question, because I don't think I covered it well enough. I'm not sure if you're familiar, but Palau has taken a stand globally, and we did this really interesting thing. Our president, Ramalasau, pretty much, so we have a moratorium on our entire EEZ at this moment, and so the law is called the Palau National Marine Sanctuary. We've designated the entire area a conservation zone, and in January that meant all of the fishing vessels that were here left and could no longer fish, and so this was a very controversial law or move on his part. However, I think together with COVID, it has really forced us here to recognize actually what we have on island and be able to mobilize the resources and the knowledge and skills that we still have here today without bringing other folks from abroad. And so in terms of management, it's forced us to go back to the way we've sort of done things before. We're looking more internally at ourselves. Everybody is sort of having more discussions about how we as communities can work together instead of relying on the law and rangers to sort of police our behavior. And in other communities, like in the Federated States of Micronesia, they have made a move in Yap where even though they have a legal MPA in place and regulations, their traditional chiefs actually penalized poachers recently who entered into their MPA. And it was a monetary cash fine on top of a fine of removing their status in their rank in their village. So I think these are becoming much more sort of popular, or we're gaining more value again in terms of how they might be useful in terms of behavior change or compliance in that way. Did I answer your question?
Yes, you touched upon it, but I mean, it's a loaded question. I mean, I wonder about our efforts, and because it's one ocean, the currents and the winds, like we got to get cooperation outside of our shores too, and the world
Yes.
market.
So I'm glad you
etc.
asked. In February, when I attended that meeting in Honolulu that Mia Taro sponsored or hosted, this was a convening of a lot of Pacific Islanders from across the region to come together and identify more traditional ways of having these dialogues and uniting under one Pacifica identity, and then taking action globally. So we had intended on having sort of a forum, a side forum at the Pacific Island Arts Festival that was supposed to happen in Honolulu. And so there was a big move to get all of our master navigators together, and we were all going to navigate and sail out to Honolulu and make this huge statement around the fact that we really need to stop and revisit the approach and rethink of how we are all related to one another. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We're a few minutes over here, and just because we have people at different time zones late at night, we'll respect that. But thank you, Madelsar, for giving us such a great window into kind of the traditional knowledge and thinking of your people there in Palau, and larger of One Reef's work. And, you know, it was, again, everybody, you know, I'm sure we got a lot out of it. There's a lot to absorb. So, you know, we wish you the best and hope that the break from tourism is taking some pressure off, but that the economic distress won't be too bad.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate all of you viewers.
Take care.
Bye-bye.